So I'm a political scientist at the CIVICA Berlin Social Science Center, and the paper I'm going to very briefly present to you is a kind of joint effort among a group of mostly political scientists, but one economist in our unit that studies political inequality at the CIVICA. So the key motivating question was for us. And we started this work right as we were all going into lockdown in March 2020, and there was so much uncertainty, and none of us really knew what to do with ourselves. So like so many other social scientists, we were like, let's put all of our time into thinking about COVID. So we wanted to learn to what extent can kind of core mainstream political economy theories, so theories in political science, theories in economics, help us understand cross-national patterns in disease burden of COVID-19. And I will say, like, the more we worked on this, the more we realized, in addition to thinking about what our theories could teach maybe someone about the pandemic, we kind of started realizing what we really wanted to learn was what the pandemic could teach us about our theories and how useful are we. And it got very existential, if I may. So I'm going to eventually briefly show you some empirical results, cross-national, looking at cumulative reported deaths. And we looked at about 20 political and social predictors, which we grouped into 4 families. So we look at state capacity, so what the state can do, political institutions, what the state is incentivized to do, which shape what the state is willing to do, political priorities, which have a big impact on what policies are chosen by governments, and then social structures, which among other things shape how effective the government's chosen policies can be. So Mikta did a wonderful job setting all this up, and I'm not going to take the time to walk through this DAG completely, but the main point is this is a complex interplay. And so we're really interested in numbers 1 through 4 on this path diagram: state capacity, political institutions, political priorities, and social structures. And they kind of have, they have a number of entry points into what is ultimately, although we would like to know deaths, what is ultimately reported deaths. These social and political variables enter into what policies are chosen, whether or not these policies actually affect behavioral change among populations, which then has a whole sort of series of kind of follow-on effects. Okay, so let me move my little sharing thing so I can actually see. Okay, just in brief, because I don't have much time. Again, we look at a list of about 20 social and political variables, but I'm just going to go through one example per family. So in terms of state capacity, which we think of in terms of what governments could do if they wanted to, what's feasible. So one very common measure of this is state fragility. Another is bureaucratic corruption. So weak bureaucratic capacity and high levels of corruption, it's reasonable to think that they adversely affect a country's ability to provide services. It lowers their reliance on expertise and access to experts. So we would expect kind of weak state capacity to lead to higher reported COVID mortalities across countries and over time. Let me go back to, oh yeah, great. So we look at a long list of political institutions in our paper, and political scientists all have their kind of favorite institutions, and we had lots of debates about, should we look at PR and this, that, and the other. But in a kind of bigger picture sense, political institutions shape the incentives of political actors. How much kind of vertical and horizontal coordination is possible? How responsive are these institutions? And so one of the political institutions we look at is the level of decentralization or centralization in countries. And decentralization could kind of go either way. And I will say a lot of our political science theories turned out like this. there are kind of arguments on either side. Sometimes that's not true and one side is stronger, but in a lot of cases, you could spin a compelling theory with a lot of literature to back it up in either direction. So on one hand, decentralization has been found to lead to more policy experimentation and greater accountability to voters. On the other hand, it kind of jams things up. It produces principal agent coordination problems. It can lead to a lot of duplicated efforts. So we could imagine decentralization being good or bad for a government's ability to respond to a crisis like COVID-19. Political priorities. So we look at a number of things here, populist governments, women leaders, the government's ideological orientation. Just to take one example, the ideology of the government should matter, we would think, in terms of what policies get chosen, how the government chooses to react. So one of the sets of arguments we discuss in our work is right-wing governments. And the literature suggests in general that right-wing governments should put greater emphasis on civil liberties and economic outcomes. And so we predicted in the paper, based on this literature, that right-wing governments would have higher disease burdens. And finally, social structures. Here we looked at a set of things, including ethnic and religious diversity, something that Mikdad mentioned. Economic inequality is another big one. And so various social structures should influence the degree to which the policies the government select actually are effective. And one of the kind of social structures we look at is kind of the level of interpersonal trust in a society. And so on the one hand, it seems like the mainstream implication from the literature on trust should be that low trust is bad. We rely on coordinated action when responding to emergencies like COVID-19. So low trust should make coordinated action more difficult. And kind of interpersonal trust is a key mechanism that flows through all sorts of theories throughout the literature on government responsiveness to crises with coordinated risks. So, ethnic diversity, economic inequality, which is something Mikdad mentioned, like why those might matter often run through a channel of, do people trust each other? Are they willing to comply with government directives? On the other hand, although I wouldn't say this is the mainstream thrust of the literature, it's possible that low levels of trust could be a good thing in this case. So if people don't trust each other, it's reasonable to expect that they would avoid each other. And avoiding each other might ultimately be not a bad thing when you're in the middle of a global pandemic. Okay, so our outcome, it's logged cumulative reported deaths per million. These are based on country self-reports. This is from the ECDC, and we look across about 160 countries. Predictors are almost uniformly from 2018 and 2019. And we look at cumulative reported COVID deaths over the course of 2020 into 2021. Now, note, there were some questions before about, well, this is reported deaths, that could be endogenous to all sorts of stuff. So as a kind of reality check and robustness test, we also look at the same set of predictors in regressions where the outcome is an alternative outcome, which is excess mortalities. And spoiler alert there is that the findings look broadly similar. Excess deaths, at least for the countries for which this is available, which is about 70 countries, are highly correlated with reported deaths. Okay, these are, I'm going to show you very quickly. Oh yeah, I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to set my alarm off. Okay, this is a cross section. I'll show you bivariate and multivariate results. And to select controls, we use a lasso procedure. And so the most commonly picked controls were the population's age structure, percentages of the population 65 and up, healthcare spending per capita, respiratory disease prevalence, and life expectancy. And as another way to get around some of these reporting issues, we also include an indicator of the quality of epidemic reporting in the country. Okay, first of all, to our existential question, do political and social features matter in a kind of broad sense? And the answer is actually yes. So including, so here we show, this is kind of predictive performance and predicting contemporaneous patterns performance for just the controls, which are the orange line, and then also including the political and social variables on top, which is the turquoise line here. And we see that in a kind of very aggregate way, adding in these political and social variables improves predictive performance on the order of about 30%. And it's somewhat better in terms of predictive performance than in predicting contemporaneous performance. So predicting the future is actually somewhat better, and this could reflect a kind of settling of patterns over time. Okay, so for the kind of very quick deliverable here, the big picture here. So I'm going to show you, our regression table is very big. Each of these rows is just a separate regression that either includes or does not include the lasso selected controls. Yeah, black has the controls in it. Overall, look at family 2, political institutions. There is a whole lot of nothing going on. We do not see really anything. Veto players, federalism, PR, you know, pick your favorite thing, and it's not really predicting very much. What we do see very strongly over time and a large substantive size here is that institutional trust really matters. So states that enjoy greater institutional trust from their citizens persistently across time experience lower levels of COVID mortality. Turning to political priorities and social structures, the last two families, political priorities have probably gotten the most attention in the media. You know, you see lots of articles about populism kills, was something Der Spiegel wrote about. Women leaders are doing an amazing job, which is something I would love to be true. And theories about electoral pressures and the timing of elections and how people are responding. Once again, we really don't see much in the data in our analyses. Social structures are a bit more mixed. Not super robust over time, again, with the exception of the bottom row here, which is interpersonal trust. So as before, with institutional trust, we have a large significant over nearly the entire period for interpersonal trust, how much people trust each other. In societies where people trust each other more, there are fewer COVID mortalities. Sorry, I should have said before, we're looking at this from June 2020 to June 2021. Okay, conclusions here. There's a major role for trust, as the previous fantastic presentation really set up, both institutional and interpersonal. We have some additional analyses in the appendix, which kind of suggest that these are tapping into separate causal processes. They're not just picking up the same thing. They are two different pathways of trust. We find not support for things that we sort of expected in terms of political institutions or political priorities. And this especially surprised us with political priorities when given how many articles you see in the popular press about things like populism and women leaders and that affecting the priorities that governments have. And then my very last slide, I promise, in terms of bigger picture, like existential implications, we were kind of going back and forth thinking, you know, why, if political and social variables do matter, quote unquote, in a big picture way, as we saw with kind of overall predictive power, we don't want to leave them out, but why do so many of our favorite theories not really kind of deliver in the end? And one reason for this may be that a lot of our political economy theories are about distributional politics. They assume a kind of set of distributional stakes where different groups have different interests and different priorities. And something like a massive tidal wave of a global pandemic sort of challenges this. You know, obviously, something that Michelle mentioned, like there are group-based inequalities and who gets affected, but across many, many countries, like this was not as politicized as you would expect it to be. Germany, like COVID didn't even really feature in the, for example, in the kind of most recent federal elections. So there's a broader sense of, yeah, we all kind of want to beat this compared to what the kind of context that a lot of our theories were written to describe and help us understand. So that's one thing, that this is not distributional politics or politics as usual. And then the other thing is that our theories seem to do better at explaining the same set of outcomes in different locations, rather than when we tried to marshal all of our knowledge as a discipline to try to explain something new. With a few important exceptions, most political scientists don't really study disease outcomes. So this was a very interesting exercise in trying to say, can we add some value here?